Welcome to the Sirius Report. This is obviously Paul from the Sirius Report. This podcast is a departure from what we normally discuss. And I put a kind of feeler out on X as to would people be interested in me discussing what I term the alt media circus, in which it literally, sadly, to a far too larger extent, is true. So what is the purpose of doing this? Well, it's to highlight why there are people who are either deliberately or unintentionally misleading us in the assertions they're making, why people appear to think that the majority viewpoint in the alt media is correct, when often it is wholly incorrect, and that if anyone expresses a minority perspective in the alt media, they're completely ignored. I think another important point to make is, and it's quite astonishing, is the fact that people do not seem to understand that the alt media has been infiltrated and compromised by the mainstream media and also by elements who would rather people had a disjointed, misleading perspective of what the reality is, as opposed to the reality that they believed was the case by the mainstream media. So for sure, the mainstream media has been lying to us for longer than we care to remember. It's full of propaganda, half-truths, mistruths, and designed to completely mislead people away from the reality of how the world is, how economics works, finance, etc., geopolitics. Now, the issue is people automatically therefore assume that anyone who has an opposing viewpoint with respect to the mainstream media is somehow therefore correct, and we should listen to them. And one of the points we're going to make today with regards to this statement is it's wholly incorrect. The alt media is full of people who are charlatans, full of people who tell lies to profit and benefit at their own expense. And let's start to highlight one or a number of the major problems and why it's largely an entertainment circus. One thing that's a big problem is probably 2 decades ago, there was an understanding that the alt media was going to develop. To what extent, it wasn't clear at that point in time, but it certainly was going to develop into something. So therefore, the powers that be decided we need to infiltrate, even at that point, the alt media, and we need to start spreading conspiracy theories which are wholly untrue. And the purpose of this was to see in an experimental sense how quickly these kind of stories can be spread. So therefore we could use the alt media in the future to spread lies that people will believe to be true. But it's also to get people to believe things which are now regarded as being established facts, which clearly aren't. 10, 15, 20 years later, the stories have spread so often, people just assume they're truthful or they're correct. They're absolutely not. And the origins of much of these conspiracy lies in with the establishment trying to take control of this and dictate what people believe and what people don't believe, just as they did in terms of the mainstream media. So you definitely have factual conspiracies that people have discussed, but this is in a very small number compared to the fake, lying conspiracies that have no basis in reality. And a big problem that also seems to happen in the alt media is people don't seem to care what people say, and all excuse me, forgiven or forgotten when they're repeatedly wrong in their assertions, or people decide these people are actually correct in their assertions when it's self-evident they absolutely are not. And another problem that you have is this idea that the alt media is this enormous empire in of itself. Huge swathes of the global population believe in this, and they don't. It's still very much a drop in the ocean. But this, as much as anything, is people who want to have a very overinflated opinion of their own worth and of who they are. And that is something the alt media suffers from in far too bigger amount and larger amount than you would hope would be the case. And the sort of categories that alt media people fall into, and by the way, I'm not saying everybody in the alt media is a problem. They're not. Absolutely not the case. Just there is far too many people who are a problem. And the type of people we feel are an issue is those who claim everything is a conspiracy. And they sell all their stories around everything is a conspiracy. This is absolutely not the case. Yes, there are conspiracies, but often people create conspiracies based on spurious information with no substance. Also, one of the biggest problems, and this happened when the Ukraine war started, people were inventing themselves as expert in the latest hot topic and making claims and statements that bore no resemblance to the reality of what was unfolding, but they saw it as an opportunity. And this is something that increasingly happens every time there's some major global events. So when obviously the whole Israel-Gaza war started, exactly the same problem arose. The other big problem you will see in the alt media is people who are very adept at crafting meaningless stories. So they will take a situation, they will make statements regarding individuals or some story that's unfolding that is impossible to prove to be true. But equally, the problem is you can't deny it. I mean, you can sit there and go, this is nonsense, but people will go, who believe the alt media go, well, it must be true because these people are making these statements. It absolutely isn't. And there's people who literally have created channels and have got huge followings on the basis of crafting these meaningless stories, which a matter of weeks or months later invariably prove not to be the case. And no one ever either chooses to not remember the fact they made these statements and these elaborate stories, or they just don't want to admit it because then it begins to shatter the illusions they have that these people they listen to are the oracle about whether it's one subject or multiple subjects. Another big problem you have in the alt media is there are people on the payroll of the very institutions they claim to despise, and they have a very clear agenda. They're often focused on one aspect of something and they hammer it to death. And it's very, very clear they're on someone's payroll. And usually at some point, they accidentally let something slip or they do something which gives the game away. People often don't see this. And therefore, they're listening to people they think are on their side, that people who care about them, they don't care about them. All they care about is their paycheck. And they have no conscience or in any way, shape, or form care a jot whether they deceive you, mislead you in any way, shape, or form. Another issue I have, this is always the case, obviously, but when people appear out of nowhere and are suddenly everywhere. This often happens, and there's often situations where you have to question this person's background or where they're pumped up as being this expert when they have no clear background, whether it's geopolitics, economics, finance, whatever it might be. These are a huge problem. And people seem to latch onto them and believe that they are an expert. And they're always ultimately and eventually give the game away where they have some agenda they're pumping. And it doesn't come out initially, but eventually it does. And we've seen this on too many occasions equally. Another problem you have is the kind of tactics that these people deploy or channels. They buy fake X followers to make it look as though they have enormous X following when they don't. They also purchase fake YouTube subscribers and people interacting. So it helps to boost the channel because people seem to have this idea that the bigger the channel, then, I can trust these people because, 100,000, 300,000, a million, whatever it is, people can't be following this channel unless they're, bona fide, unless they know what they're talking about, unless they're sincere, because everyone thinks people in the alt media are sincere because they oppose the mainstream media perspective. Another big problem is on the X channel is because of people earning advertising revenue. They just make deliberately provocative statements which have very little basis in reality, and they know in the end this will get a huge amount of responses. And they're doing it just to purely earn advertising revenue. They don't care what they actually say. And the idea it has to have any basis in reality or the truth is irrelevant. The other big problem that you have in terms of the tactics people deploy is they twist a kernel of truth into this huge, elaborate story. So, and the 1% of the truth is in there, and the rest of it's just lies, embellishment, and just trying to present an idea to try and get people to engage with them. And this therefore adds into the whole issue of people on YouTube, on other social platforms, X, etc. The other thing you'll see people do is repeat the same thing over and over again to convey this impression that they're experts in a field. And I want to make some reference to the Ukraine war being an example where we saw situations where people were trying to sell themselves as experts on the war, as though they have the inside track, they know what's going on, they know people on the front line, and they clearly don't. And they're just recycling information from other channels who have no understanding either. But again, this is all crafting the perspective. Trust us. We know and understand what's going on in the world, whatever aspect this may refer to, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Israel, whatever it is. And this is all just trust us. And then they suck people in. And it doesn't matter in the end then what they say, people will largely believe it, unless occasionally they stray out their lane into areas they have no understanding of in totality. And then they expose themselves to the fact, in reality, they don't have any understanding of anything. The other thing you get, which is very telling, is the cliques that form all over social media. And this reinforces this collective expertise. And this is often completely misleading. And one of the problems I think is hugely relevant to this whole discussion is the listeners, the people listening. I mean, because they never assess how often the people they believe in are actually correct in anything they say. They never reflect upon the past. It seems as though being correct is irrelevant. And in fact, often when you point out to people from our experience that we said these things years ago and everyone ignored it and it turned out to be true, they almost get annoyed because you're pointing out the fact that they should have listened to what we said at that point in time. And it also isn't just us, it's other people as well. And really a lot of them just want to seek validation, the listeners that is, of what they want to believe to be true. So if anyone says anything contradictory, they're not interested. And overall, the problem is many listeners are completely skewed away from understanding the reality of things, and they get very upset when you challenge anyone who they believe to be an oracle or that someone they can trust or someone they can believe in what they're saying, and you challenge any aspect. And it's not even directly, it can be indirectly. They get very, very annoyed. Well, this is not a healthy perspective to have. The alt media was supposed to be an alternative to the mainstream media. And in some senses, and in far too many senses, it's evolved into precisely that. And it's even worse because I can remember people sitting in pubs in the United Kingdom in the 1980s who claimed to be the experts of everything. And people used to sit there and after 2 minutes used to laugh at them and go, "You're ridiculous. You don't know anything." Well, that sort of 80s pub mentality is now all over social media. And the worst thing is people tend to believe these people used to sit in pubs, whereas previously people seemed to have the capability to easily dismiss them. And in essence, this is making the whole worth of the alt media significantly less than it should be. This should have been a really positive alternative. It should have been populated with people who actually understood what they were talking about and were genuine and weren't populist, weren't just making all the right noises and saying things so people are engaged with them. But there's far too many people who have platforms who are just there for money. They just want to make money, earn revenue, and they don't care. They have no ounce of honesty about them, integrity. And for us, this is totally appalling. because at the end of the day, if you don't have those, then then really you're just in it just purely for your own benefit. And for sure, we in the Sirius report could have done exactly the same, made all the right noises, said all the things people wanted to hear, and had a far bigger channel than we do have. Okay, we've got a large following on X. We've started to do YouTube, obviously free content to try and grow that channel as well. But we generally care about the fact that people aren't manipulated, that they aren't misled. And this is why we're putting this clip out. This is by no means an exhaustive assessment of the problem, but it's to give people some ideas and to make people in future think about channels they're listening to and asking themselves the question, is this person being, or group or whoever it is, are they being honest? Do they have integrity? Are they trying to mislead me? Are they trying to just benefit themselves totally financially? Of course, everyone who has a channel has to make money. I mean, we're the same. But do they actually have the principles that you would want to see in the alt media, as opposed to all the lies, all the propaganda, everything else that's a huge failure of the mainstream media? So I think that's a good point to end this podcast. There is plenty more in-depth discussion to be had in the future, and maybe to go into some more depth as to the extent of the problem, because it's huge and it's far bigger than people realize. And what's the point in swapping one illusion, the mainstream media, for what can be far too big an illusion called the alt media? As I said, there are good channels, there are solid, dependable people. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm not, basically accusing everybody in the alt media of being disingenuous. Absolutely not. But when I say there are far too many, it's all relative. And I hope this makes people question things and think a bit more about channels they follow or channels they will follow in the future, and really ask themselves the question, what's the purpose of this channel? To benefit me, or to financially benefit the people who obviously own and run these channels? And with that, I'll say goodbye.